Yeah, where I don't sit in front of somebody and you I go to the theater right here. I try not to
Good morning. Good morning to those of you in the room and those who are watching this on live stream and who will be watching it in the future as we preserve it for posterity. I'm grateful to you all for being here. My name is Guy Irwin. I'm the president of United Lutheran Seminary, and we have a remarkable lineup of speakers this morning. It's not my place to introduce them, but let me just say how happy I am and honored that they're with us today. Our first speaker is a very distinguished theologian and commentator, and his work, especially on colonialism and lifting up indigenous voices, has been very important to me. Thank you, Dr. de la Torre, for being with us. And I had the honor of being with Joan Trumpauer Mulholland and her son Loki for dinner last night, so I got to know them a little bit. What wonderful people to have with us. She's the source of the world's most famous and glamorous mugshot. We'll hear more about those stories later.
And I'm wearing it on my shirt.
Yes, that's right, and she's wearing it on her shirt. So this is a challenging time for all. I know that's one of the understatements of the week. But in the moment now in which falsehoods are framed as truth and bigotry is framed as heroism, and we are struggling not just for justice, but for clarity and a sense of what one can really say and believe in this context. I think it's especially important for those of us who work in the field of truth, in a sense, to lift our voices as well. And one of the ways we can do that at ULS is by sponsoring conferences like this. I hope this is a day that breaks through the clouds, breaks open minds and hearts, and leads us with greater confidence into the future. Thank you again for being here, our speakers and our guests. I'd like to introduce Dr. Nelson Rivera, professor of theological ethics, who is going to come up and introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. Oops, too loud? It is good to be with you all and see so many familiar faces and friends with us this morning. I am pleased to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Miguel de la Torre. Dr. de la Torre is professor of ethics, social ethics, and Latinx studies at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. He's an international Fulbright scholar who has taught courses and has lectured in countries such as Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, Germany, Costa Rica, Palestine, Taiwan, Thailand, and I better stop there. I only have so much time. Since obtaining his doctoral degree in 1999, Dr. De La Torre has authored over 100 articles and published 41 books, each of which won national awards, including several edited volumes. Among his publications are Doing Christian Ethics from the Margins, a favorite of mine, Latino Social Ethics, The Politics of Jesus, Decolonizing Christianity, Embracing Hopelessness, and Ethics, a Liberative Approach. In addition, he wrote a screenplay to a documentary on immigration, Trails of Hope and Terror, which has been screened in over 18 film festivals, winning several awards. He has been president of the Society of Race, Ethnicity, and Religion, and of the Society of Christian Ethics. Dr. De La Torre has received several national book awards and is a frequent speaker at national and international scholarly religious events and meetings. He also speaks at churches and nonprofit organizations on the intersection of religion with race, class, gender, and sexuality. In 2020, the American Academy of Religion bestowed on him the Excellence in Teaching Award. The following year, 2021, AAR also conferred upon him the Martin E. Marty Public Understanding of Religion Award. De La Torre is the first scholar to receive the two most prestigious awards presented by his guild and the first Latinx to receive either one of them. It is my good fortune that Miguel and I were classmates in graduate school. We are honored to have Dr. De La Torre with us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Buenos dias. And just a correction, that's 49 books, but who's counting? I have to update it one of these days, yes. You know, usually in these convocation gatherings, you usually get a speaker who is very motivational about the journey, about the beginnings. Someone who can tell you something like, if your mind could conceive it and your heart could believe it, you can achieve it. Unfortunately, you invited me. For I am not going to talk about the hope of the future, but rather I'm going to talk about embracing the hopelessness of the now. I'm going to try to figure out why this moral arc is broken. One of the intellectual mentors that I have is Miguel de Unamuno, who in 1913 wrote The Tragic Sense of Life. Basically, he says que Dios no os da paz y sí glorias. Let me translate for those of you who have yet learned the language of the angels. May God deny you peace so that God can give you glory. See, anyone can get a job as a custodian of a church or a teacher at a theological school, where you just keep the wheels rolling. But if a theological education means anything, if it means more than just a job, then you can never have peace. See, to fight for liberation, that is promised in the biblical text will lead to suffering. It will lead to a glory. Think of Isaiah being sewn in half. Think of Jeremiah being stoned, or Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. Or think of Jesus' crucifixion, or James' beheading. You see, this thing we call Christianity, that we call faith, is dangerous. And the only way it could be peaceful is if you allow Christianity to be captured by the empire and be a spokesperson for those in power rather than holding those in power accountable for their anti-Christian views. So if you want peace, if you want everyone praising you, maybe you're doing something wrong. I'm often told that we should practice speaking truth to power. I don't have the time nor the inclination to do that. And the reason being, power already knows the truth. Don't you think that the people who are the 1% controlling the vast wealth of this nation and of the world already know the truth? Why waste our time speaking to them? I would rather speak truth to the powerless. Because in speaking truth to the powerless, that's where we receive the glory that Miguel de Unamuno was talking about. It is in that raising of consciousness. It is in convincing those who have been told that they are objects, that they instead have subjectivity. Of sharing with those who believe they are non-humans of their humanity. Such a ministry, such a calling is revolutionary. To adhere to peace is to preach a Christianity that has absolutely nothing to say about our children being placed in cages, or a neoliberal economic order that robs the global South of its natural resources and of its cheap labor. It is to preach a Christianity in where only some lives are important while the vast majority are unimportant. I argue that to achieve glory, we must embrace the Saturday and its hopelessness. I argued that to embrace glory, we must reject what has come to be known as Eurocentric Christianity. And let me be very clear. All enlightened, Eurocentric philosophical and theological thought is detrimental to communities of color. It is also detrimental to the colonized of the world. You see, when the French during the Revolution cried out, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, it was never meant for the colonized people in Haiti, in Algiers, or in Vietnam. It was only meant for white French men. James Cone, may he rest in peace, would call such a Christianity satanic. And I would agree. We must reject this Christianity because it has been constructed in such a way that it justifies the oppression of the marginalized of the world. And it spiritualizes that oppression, so that somehow you are being true Christians because you're suffering under such marginalization. How white Americans read their Bible is damning to the rest of the marginalized world. So employing a Eurocentric philosophical ideal and thinkers for those of us who are of color, only colonizes our own minds. It defines reality through a Eurocentric worldview, in where when we do that, we become complicit with our own oppression. Now, just a quick side note. You realize that when I keep saying white, I'm not talking about skin pigmentation. I'm talking about ontological whiteness, and where many people of color themselves are white, because they have adopted this white Eurocentric way of thinking that contributes to their own oppression. It is an adoption of white supremacy. Now, before I begin talking about rejecting white theology, I need to really deal with my own complicity, how my mind itself has been so colonized. I remember when I was a young hot Latino, I had this red Capri, and I was driving from Miami to New York City, where I grew up. And somewhere along the New Jersey Turnpike, close to Elizabeth, I think exit number 10, if I recall, I get pulled over. And the officer comes up to the window and says, "Son, you mind if I search your car?" Now, he had a gun and I didn't, so I said, "Yeah, sure, go right ahead." So he searched the car, and as he was searching, I asked him, "What are you looking for?" And his response was, "Well, young Latino men," he didn't use the word hot, "young Latino men with Miami-Dade County license plates usually are bringing cocaine south to New York City." So after he searched my car, he found nothing. I did a good job hiding. No, he found nothing. And he gave me a ticket for going 5 miles over the speed limit on the New Jersey Turnpike. Literally. As I was driving away, what went through my mind, not the indignation of being racially profiled before I ever knew what that was. What went through my mind was, thank God the cops are doing their job in keeping us safe. You see, my mind was so colonized that I was seeing myself through the eyes of my oppressors. I was defining myself through the eyes of those who denied my very humanity. And though I was not a criminal, I saw myself as a potential criminal just because I occupied a Latino body. So the first act of liberation has to be the decolonizing of my mind, which is difficult to do because I have to, to study ethics, to study history, to study theology, it has to be Eurocentric. I study these things that profit from my marginalization, which is blasphemous. I embrace Eurocentric concepts like hope, which I'll talk about more in a little while, which pacifies us in the midst of our oppression, leading to spiritual liberation while denying me physical liberation, believing in the riches of the hereafter rather than the poverty of the here and now. And such a colonized mind, I would argue, makes God vomit. José Martí, another one of my intellectual mentors, said it best. El vino de plátano, y si sale agrio, sigue siendo nuestro vino. Martí, in the late 1800s, living in New York City, is trying to figure out how do we, as a people, create our own way of thinking apart from the colonizing of Spain and the rising colonizers of the United States. And what he says is, we must make our wine out of plantains. And it doesn't matter if we get it wrong, if it comes out sour, it's still our wine. And what he was trying to help us understand is, we must make our philosophical thoughts from our own cultural ingredients, and it doesn't matter if we get it wrong because it belongs to us. And I create my wine, I become a winemaker, I create this new wine which I refuse to put into the old Eurocentric wineskins, lest they burst, because it is a wine that is rooted in the rejection of Eurocentric philosophical supremacy. And how do I do this? Contextual, grassroots. What I say may not bring me peace, and that's okay. Over breakfast, we were talking about the recent assassination of Cook. I have the dubious honor of being on his watch list. And I confess it's kind of hard to hear him being praised as a paragon of free speech when he literally put me on a list in where I received so many death threats designed to prevent me from having free speech. And yet, even though I am a coward, I'll refuse to play the role. Because if I don't speak, the stones themselves will be forced to cry out. And that is what it means, I believe, to be a Christian. So here's the question that I want to wrestle with for the rest of the time I'm with you all. What would a social ethics look like from the perspective of the disenfranchised in an era where the moral arc is broken? I took a group of students to Cuernavaca, Mexico. And the reason was I wanted to connect the poverty in the squatter villages that we visited in an area called La Estación to the privileges, the possessions, and the power we enjoy in the so-called first world. And during that visit, we went to some horrible living conditions, huts, dirt floor. And afterwards, one of my students said, "Oh, these people, such miserable lives that they're living. But when I looked into the eyes of the little girl, I saw the hope in her eyes." At that point, I had an epistemological meltdown. Because my comment was, I'm not quite sure what you saw in her eyes. But another 5 years, she either is going to be turning tricks to put food on the table or might be stuck in an abusive marriage. You see, there is no hope for that little girl. Into poverty she was born, into poverty she will die, as will her children and her children's children. And maybe the hope that you think you saw in her eye is more an excuse for you to do nothing because it's in God's hands, as opposed to really seeing her and the situation and context in which she finds herself. I have found that hope becomes an excuse to do nothing. Now, I know when I badmouth hope, isn't this like one of the gifts of the spirits? What? Love, joy, peace, and hope? And here I am denigrating hope right now? Is it all things work for good, those who are called according to God's purposes. But what if they aren't? As so often happens in history. You see, when I read hope, like any good scholar, I do read my Bible in Spanish. And the word used for hope is esperanza, which comes from the word esperar. And esperar means to wait. So when I hope, I am waiting. And the waiting may last 400 years in Egypt. And the waiting may be for something good or something worse. So this optimism that is wrapped up in the English word hope is not necessarily wrapped up in when we say hope in Spanish. Okay. Got a couple of pastors in the room, so if you heard this, nod or raise your hand. I'm sure you heard that story, that parable about the little girl walking on the beach one day after a horrible storm. Already people are shaking their heads, yes. And the beach is full of starfish. Yeah. And the little girl's throwing them back one at a time. And there's a grumpy old man watching this, and he goes, "You can't save them all." But she picks up one and says, "But I'll make a difference in this one," and throws it in. Right? Okay. I'm the grumpy old man. Because what we have done is that we have reduced the good news to the personal so that we could focus on the one that's going to survive, so we could ignore the thousands of others on the beach who are dying and rotting. You see, I grew up in the slums of New York City's Hell Kitchen when it was Hell's Kitchen. The apartment building had only one bathroom per tenement floor. You know, rat, roach infested, drug addicts. I mean, it was horrible. I made it out. I'm that one starfish that you could lift up and put on a pedestal and say, God is good. See, one can make it. But so many of my friends are 6 feet under right now. And me making it was not because I was smarter or holier or prettier. I just got lucky. But if I can focus on the one that makes it, I could ignore all the other ones who are dying, crying out, they cannot breathe. It is that hope of focusing on the one to ignore the many that becomes highly problematic. Now, for the great prophet of hope, Moltmann, who relies on Hegel, argues that God is not outside of history but within history. Therefore, we can trust God because God will keep God's promises. And because God will keep God's promises, we can have hope for the future. However, Primo Levi, who was in Auschwitz, deals with a God who did not keep God's promises to God's chosen. When he says, there is no God, only Auschwitz. You see, what do we do when the God of liberation fails to liberate? When the God of liberation does not show up? Now, our theology would say God is always there, and God would always save us. But history shows us that is not always the case. How do we bring reality together with faith? Martin Luther King says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I would argue the moral universe could care less which way it bends. It's just as easily will bend towards chaos and injustice as towards justice. And if we want it to bend towards justice, we're the ones who have to do the bending. Because it will not bend by itself. And I say that because I'm a student of history. And I see the constant injustices that we face. You ever wonder how every once in a while Jesus appears in a tortilla someplace? I mean, you've seen that, they found Jesus' image in the tortilla. Yeah. Well, I was curious about that, and apparently, according to scientists in Korea, they wired up people's brains, and they found out that when faced with an image that is a static image, and static image, that's when you look at something that just has a lot of lines and dots, and usually our brains are geared to try to find order in the disorder, and often we see a face. I mean, have you ever noticed that? You're just sitting there and looking at something that just has a lot of chaotic static, and all of a sudden you see a happy face or a sad face or the face of George Washington or something like that. Well, that's because our brains are geared to find order within the disorder. In the same way, we look at the disorder of history and try to find some order in it, because if we don't, it becomes scary. Walter Benjamin, the historian, would argue that history is nothing but chaos, barbarous chaos, and what we think is progress is really the barbarism of society. Hegel gives us this beautiful dialectical history, and we're moving in an upward slant towards perfection. And of course, as a child of the Enlightenment, we have people like either Adam Smith adopting it, and where the economics is going to get better, and the rising tide will lift all boats, or you have Marx, in where the proletarian is going to revolt, and we're going to get better, and we're going to eventually reach the utopia of communism and do away with the state. So both communism and capitalism are trends of the Enlightenment project, having the same salvation history. See, unfortunately, I drank the Foucault Kool-Aid, in where he argues there is no reason or rhyme to history. It is nonlinear. It is disjointed. A so-called dark age could follow a so-called enlightened age, or the other way around. Sometimes history may go this way, then that way, and these are dots that are not connected, and we only connect the dots to create some kind of order so that we're not scared of the chaos in which we live. The writer of Ecclesiastes said it best: vanity of vanity, says the teacher, absolute futility, everything is meaningless. Preach that on Sunday. So in the chaos of history, in the midst of white Christian nationalism, hope becomes a way of domesticating us to this reality. How then do we embrace the Saturday? This is that liminal space between the crucifixion on Friday and the not yet resurrection of Sunday. This is the Saturday where the vast majority of oppressed and marginalized people live and exist. And if we call for radical solidarity, it means sitting with them in the Saturday, as opposed to providing some trite biblical verse that everything's going to work okay. If instead I see the hope in their eyes, and preach that hope, I fear that I will be contributing to their domestication. When I was in Auschwitz, there's this sign over the gate, and anyone who's there is familiar, work will set you free. That provided hope. And when I read that, I would think if I could just keep my head down, if I don't make waves, if I don't fight back, if I follow the rules, I might make it. Now, I'm not comparing the Holocaust with what's going on now, but for many, with all the turmoil that's just been happening over the last week, some of us are saying, well, if I don't post, if I don't say anything about what's going on, if I keep my head down, maybe I'll survive. You won't. Because the structures are designed for our destruction. But hope that we may survive is what domesticates us so that we could become ineffective. We could say all the correct rhetoric, but it doesn't save us from the chaos of history. Now, at this point, you're probably saying, well, where is God in all this? Where is the God doing lamentation? I'm, being a good old Southern Baptist, I know my Bible. And there's stuff in that Bible that scares the heck out of me. Like sometimes God is just absent. I mean, what is it that Jesus cries out from the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, of course, I know we try to save God from God. And we say things like, well, you see, Jesus was carrying all the sins of the world, and God, is such a snowflake. God cannot look upon sin, and therefore God could not see Jesus, and then Jesus felt totally abandoned. I mean, really? That's your theology? That God can't see sin because God is so delicate and so fragile? No. Jesus felt abandonment in that crucifixion because God was absent. Or sometimes God's a little sadistic. I mean, have you read the book of Job? I mean, what happens? Satan comes along, I'll make you a bet. I could bet you I could get Job to curse you. And God, being a gambling person, says, sure, I'll take that bet. And then, Job loses everything, family, health, wealth. And then for 50-some chapters, we're trying to figure out why. And at the end, what's the answer? I'm God, I do whatever the hell I want. Tough. Not very pastoral. And God sometimes has this side of God that's not fit with my understanding of God. What was it that Isaiah says? If good or evil enters a city, is it not I, God, who send it? Wait a minute, God sends good. Any evil? No, I must have read that wrong. But then it says, and God send evil spirits unto Saul. Wait a minute, God sends evil spirits? Now, I don't understand that. That's why I'm not a biblical scholar. And I'm not a theologian. Although some of my best friends are biblical scholars and theologians. I'm an ethicist. I'm trying to figure out if I say that the biblical text is important to ethics, then I'm forced to read the entire biblical text with all of its problems. And basically, the God of the biblical text is not the same God that we have created in our Christian faith. So what do I do with a God who sometimes is not there? I have been arguing for badass Christianity. This is a Christianity. say that here? Yeah. This is a Christianity that rejects hope because hope provides easy answers and quick fixes. And you can't do that with people who are suffering. Now, unlike Moltmann, I don't say that the opposite of hope is despair. You see, despair is when you roll yourself up in the fetus position and you gnash your teeth and you cry because there's nothing you can do. I argue that the opposite of hope is desperation. That's a very different word because desperation forces me, propels me to do something. When I meet people crossing the desert, the smallest desert into the United States, I sometimes go down to the desert and leave water and food and on the migrant trails. And every once in a while I meet migrants who are crossing the desert. And I could tell you that when they left, it wasn't out of despair. It was out of desperation, knowing that if they stay, they die. If they cross the desert, they may die, but they might make it. And in that ambiguity of life, they take action. So the hopelessness that I preach is an ethical hopelessness that attempts to propel people towards action. Miguel de Unamuno, who I mentioned earlier, I like to call him the unbelieving believer. See, what he says is, it doesn't matter if there is a God. What's important is believing in a God that might not exist. And let me break it down for you. You cannot prove to me that there is a God. You cannot prove to me that there is no God. Whether I believe or I don't believe is a choice. And we call that choice faith. Because if you can prove there's a God or there is not a God, it no longer is faith. It's science, it's certainty. So I choose to believe regardless if there is or there is not a God. I can't tell you how liberating that is. Because I don't have to worry now anymore of trying to save God or protect God or anything. I mean, I just believe in the God that may or may not be there. Therefore, I'm not seeking what is the correct doctrine as to why we suffer. I'm looking for the correct praxis that can be employed, fully aware that the injustices of the world may win and may still lead to my crucifixion. And it means that I fight for justice not because I'm going to win. I probably won't. And I don't fight for justice for an extra ruby in my crown when I get to heaven. And that makes it transactional. I fight for justice because I have no other choice. I fight for justice because, number one, it defines my faith in the God who I choose to believe in, whether they exist or not. And more importantly, I fight for justice because it defines my very humanity. So, we stand before neoliberalism that has won. Oppression will continue. What becomes our response? If I have hope, chances are I will burn out a lot quicker. I mean, I don't mean this to denigrate social workers. They're a very important part of our society, but how long do they usually last on a job? Usually just a couple of years, because they believe that they're going to change the world. And the world doesn't change. It gets worse. I've been working with immigration issues for the last 25 years. It's worse now than it was back then. I long for the nice days of the Bush administration. The point I'm getting at is, if I believe I was the savior of the world and I was going to change things, I would have been burned out a long time ago. But I'm not called to save the world. I'm called to be faithful to what I believe is God's call. So, ethical response. We have created a system, a society, an ethos where I have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department so I can protest the police department for police brutality. We have domesticated protests in where I can carry a sign saying defund the police and take a picture of myself and put it on Facebook and say, look, I'm an activist, knowing that nothing will change. What becomes the ethics I employ that does not fall into that trap? And this is what I've been calling an ethics para joder. Now, for those of you who don't know Spanish at this point, I'm glad, because the term joder is a certain word you never use in polite conversation. It is similar to a certain four-letter word in English that begins with F and ends with K. But the way I like to translate it is an ethics that screws with the system. Fun fact, when I first published this, Baylor University Press published a book in where I first introduced this ethics para joder. Baylor, if you don't know anything about Baylor University Press, they're a very Baptist conservative press. When the editor asked me what did that word mean, I said, oh, it just means to screw with. He found out what it meant after the book was published. To which I said, yes, I'm employing an ethics para joder. I was screwing with Baylor University Press. But that's beside the point. So, this is an ethic that literally overturns the table in the temple. It is an ethics, and let me be clear, I'm not inventing anything new here. This is not something I invented in my ivory tower. This is what oppressed people have always done. It's an ethics that is based on the trickster image. And every oppressed group has tricksters. The African American community has Bear Rabbit and Bear Bear. The indigenous people have Coyote and Spider. My Puerto Rican friends have Juan Bobo. My Mexican friends have Cantinflas. Being a good Cuban, I have Pepito. We all have these tricksters figures that speak truth while playing the fool, or does actions while playing the fool so they can remain safe. The issue is, how can we be wise as serpents but gentle as doves? And you can accomplish that by playing the trickster. And the biblical text is full of tricksters. Unfortunately, our Puritan ideology has beaten them out of the biblical text. But I mean, really, Jacob didn't know that the woman that he married was not the woman that was in his bed that night? He ends up with two women and more crop? Come on. He couldn't figure that out. I mean, how dark was that tent? I mean, you have Tamar, who to hold Judah responsible. In a patriarchal society, she plays the prostitute, and when Judah's saying, we need to kill the woman who, and the person that slept with this woman, he goes, oh, here's his staff and ring. Oh, they belong to you. That's playing the trickster. The ultimate trickster, I would say, is Satan. I don't think he's the personification of evil, but rather the ultimate trickster. Jesus learned something about his ministry in the wilderness when Jesus refused to fall to the temptations of the trickster. Because after that is when the ministry begins. And the greatest Jorerón of all is Jesus himself. You know, do we pay taxes to Caesar? Well, show me the coin. You know, whose face is there? So playing the tricks, I'm not inventing something new. I am trying to recapture something within my community that is the roots by which I want to make my wine. And my muse in all this is a street gang called the Young Lords. I'm not sure if all you are familiar with the Young Lords, but they were a street gang in both Chicago and New York City. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of what the Young Lords did. In New York, during the late 60s, they went ahead and cleaned up all the streets, and they put all the garbage in bags and put them on the street corners. And then they called the sanitation department and said, hey, we just cleaned the streets, come pick up the garbage. Now, the sanitation department in the late 60s only went into communities of color whenever they had extra time. There was no set schedule, like in the white neighborhoods. So they laughed and hung up. So the Young Lords took all those garbage bags, during rush hour traffic, went to 3rd Avenue and lit them on fire. Okay? They were screwing with the system. Cops came, beat them up, threw them in jail. But the New York Times also showed up and started doing stories on the sanitation department. And now the sanitation department picks it up every couple of weeks, twice a week. This ethics para joder is an attempt to play the trickster before the government, to force the government to do and follow its own rhetoric, which is to clean streets and keep people safe. But not just the government. Another thing that the Young Lords did, they went to the Primera Iglesia Metodista, the First Methodist Church of Spanish Harlem, and they talked to the pastor about, pastor, we want to have, a breakfast table for our children when they're going to school. We want to have, clothes cloths. We want attorneys to come and help our people deal with the tenements that they live in. We want to provide cultural study, of the Latino community. And the pastor looked at them and said, you bunch of commies, get out of here. So the first Sunday of Advent Sunday in '69, they came, they picked up the pastor and they threw him out of the church, and they nailed to the doors the People's Church. And they did all those things, and the church was packed every Sunday. In other words, not just holding the government accountable to its rhetoric, also holding the church accountable to its rhetoric. Now, this idea of an ethics para joder also comes, for me, from my Orisha Elegua. Explain what that means. Being a child of the Caribbean, we Caribbean folk sometimes hold on to 2 or 3 faith traditions at the same time, even though they're different from each other. And that's okay, because I thrive in the contradictions of faith. And if you say, but wait a minute, but that's all contradictory. See, Eurocentric mindset, it has to be reasonable. Everything has to fit perfectly. Miguel Unamuno says, I'm contradicting myself. That just proves I'm human. All humans contradict themselves. I'm willing to admit it. In the States, you're either a Methodist or a Lutheran. You can't be both. In Cuba, where I come from, the joke is, how many people are Catholic? About 70% of the population. How many people follow the Orishas? About 100% of the population. We have a more fluid understanding of the spiritual world. And the Orishas are from Yoruba land, which used to be Nigeria, and the enslaved folks brought this religion faith to Cuba. And Elegua, everybody has an Orisha. My Orisha is Elegua. Elegua is the ultimate trickster. Like I said, oppressed groups throughout the world have trickster figures. So I do my ethics based on Yoruban cosmology, understanding and reading the scripture through the social lens. And before you say, wait a minute, that's not right, how is that different from reading the scriptures through a Platonic Greek Gentile lens, which is what happened. I mean, I always wonder if Paul would have made instead of making a left in Macedonia, if he would have made a right, we all would have probably be practicing more Buddhist-type Christianity. So my faith is rooted within my culture, mi vino de plátanos, my wine of plantain. And this is what my culture has led me to. So this is an ethics that I'm arguing for, that nonviolently tries to ethically lie so I could discover what is truth. That ethically cheats so I could develop a level playing field. That ethically steals so I could feed the hungry. That ethically jokes so I could say serious truths. And that ethically disrupts and deceives so that I could usher in liberation. Gracias. I think we have time for some Q&A.
Well, I feel better. My wife has been exposed for what it is, and I hope yours as well. Let's take some time for a few questions, and then I believe we'll also have a moment in the hallway when you'll be willing to sign a few books. So the microphone is here. I'll make sure it's on. Please state your question in the form of a question.
Hello. Thank you very much for that. My name is Jim, and my pronouns are he, him. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with a quote from Václav Havel, the Czech playwright and dissident, that I've always kind of tried to use to kind of get at this idea of hope, which he says that hope is not about optimism, and it's not about things turning out right. It's about things making sense to you and your life and your work making sense.
So, if that works, great. And let me be clear, I'm not here to take away anybody's hope. If you're hopeful and that works for you, hallelujah, praise the Lord. I'll give you an example. I mentioned I walked the deserts, and I never forget, I came across this one guy and who was very thirsty. We gave him water. He said that when he began his walk, when you begin to cross the desert, you bring two jugs of water with you, and hopefully that lasts you for enough days to cross the desert. He said early on the journey he tripped and fell, and he lost all his water. And then he said, but the Virgin Mary appeared, La Virgen María appeared to me, and she led me to you, and now I have water. I did not lose my hope. And my response was not a theological thesis on hopelessness, but instead I said, Alleluia, Gloria a la Virgen María, praise be, and because that's not my job. Hope helped him survive the desert. All power to him. Of course, in my mind I was thinking, where the hell was the Virgin Mary when every 5 days, 4 people die in that desert from thirst? But I didn't go into that. This ethics of hopelessness is for those who truly have no hope, who already are dead. Because we have created a Christianity that if I have no hope, something's wrong with me. I don't have enough faith. And I don't want them to feel that. I tell you what, I never get any pushback whatsoever when speaking to predominantly marginalized community. When I was writing the book Embracing Hopelessness, my TA at the time was a gang member, and he was picked up again and sent to jail. And he asked if he could take the manuscript with him. And I said, sure, go right ahead. So he took the manuscript and he began a book club among other gang members in jail over my book on hopelessness. And when he came out, he said, you know, they all got it. This wasn't an issue for them. They live in the hopelessness. And for the first time, they were able to see and verbalize what they were always feeling. That's who I'm writing my books to. And for those of you of the dominant culture, you have the privilege of overhearing my conversation with my people. And in that privilege, you could either agree, great, disagree, great. Doesn't matter to me. I'm speaking to those who really have no hope. And when they have no hope, all too often the choice is self-harm or escapism. And I'm trying to say, no, let's channel that hopelessness. Because when you have nothing to lose, that's when you become the most dangerous in changing society. And that's what I'm after.
Good morning. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Do you have any advice for where the line is between the both and helping individuals, helping, fixing the system? I mean, you yourself, you told the starfish story, but then you also mentioned how you're walking the desert and you're helping that one, but also working to change immigration reform. So any advice on where one finds the balance in that?
That's a good question because I have no idea. And I say that honestly. I don't know because you're right. We need to be careful not to focus the attention on the one. But by the same token, we need to be in solidarity with the many. And while I just met this one person crossing the desert, he's not the only one. I was trying to catch all the people crossing the desert that day. So it's really hard to know where that line is. I will say this, and this is the advice I give to my students. Get involved on two issues. We can't save the world. We can't get involved in every ethical issue out there. We'll go crazy. But two issues. One that touches your skin and one that does not. So for me, immigration touches my skin, being that I was an undocumented immigrant when I first came to this country. So that touches my skin. I'm invested in that. And because I'm invested in that, and because I'm in that mindset, I know the need of having to walk the desert, and I also know the need of putting my body in the courtroom when the injustice of a stream row conviction is going on. So I try to find a balance in that, and I find it within the community of other people invested in this issue. So it's never just me alone saying, here's what I must do. It's more like, what must we do? And then the second issue that I'm involved in is one that does not touch my skin, that I have no dog in that fight. Okay? And here's the reason. When I talk about immigration issues, I'm easily dismissed because, well, what do you expect from a Latino who himself was undocumented? I'm sorry, who was illegal? I mean, what do you expect? Of course he's going to say those things. But when you say it, you don't have a dog in that fight, so I don't know. I'm assuming. I could be wrong. Please correct me if I am. So they'll listen to you before they listen to me. And you could be a voice in areas that will never, ever listen to me. Now, I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive because, quite frankly, I could speak for myself. Thank you very much. I don't need you to speak for me. Okay? However, I don't want you to speak for me. I want you to speak about how you are privileged by me being in this country and how you are complicit with the immigration crisis. You see what I'm saying? In other words, you cannot speak about what it means to be an immigrant in this country. Again, I'm assuming things, because you haven't experienced what I experienced. But you can talk about how you're complicit with my oppression as an undocumented immigrant. And that they will listen to you before they listen to me. And you can say that with total integrity and authenticity. Okay. And again, when you are in that group working with me on these issues, then hopefully the community will help you understand where that line is also. So it's a communal, not an individualistic way of dealing with where the line falls. I'm sorry? The other one I was involved, I was asked, this is before the 2005 marriage equality, I was asked to be a spokesperson for the Human Rights Campaign. And I told them no, because I said, I'm not gay. I mean, I can't speak about that. But they wanted a Southern Baptist on their team for some reason. So what I did, and this is where I learned this. I said, okay, I would only talk about how I am a recovering homophobic and complicit with the oppression of the queer community. So they sent me to all these evangelical Southern Baptist churches to talk about this. You know, and I was able to speak with total integrity, but I never ever talked about what it means to be gay in America because I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. Other comments or questions?
You said comment, even though Dr. Zimmerman said question. I know you haven't visited India, but I'm amazed at the resonance of what you just said with the so-called untouchable Dalit communities who were my teachers, whom I served, whom I write about. Yesterday was one of the few Sundays where I could sit in the congregation with my wife rather than being the preacher all the time, and it was the lost sheep and the lost coin, and my mind went to the communities I served. Because the thing they would have done immediately and connected with would be, we found the sheep, we've called people to celebrate. Any celebration involves eating and drinking, and what better to eat than the sheep? She's found the coin, she's called people to celebrate. You can't celebrate without eating and drinking. And what better use of the lost coin than to spend it for a feast? So thank you so much for everything you said.
Thank you for the comment.
Thank you very much for everything that you said. I can relate to everything. I'm from North Philadelphia. And I came and got my degree here. What I wanted to say is that I started out as a teacher and ended up teaching high school. And as a result of it, I had to help many students who were, I guess you would say they were immigrants. But at the time, all I wanted to do was help them to get to graduate. So even when I was thinking about what you said about helping one person in a desert. And I was thinking, that may have been one person in the desert, but that person had many people connected to him or her. And that when we help one, we are helping many and sometimes nations and don't realize it. So I just thank you for that.
Would you join me in showing our appreciation and thanks? Dr. De La Torre will be out in the hallway for you to greet personally. Lunch is at noon, and then we'll reconvene here at 1:30 p.m. And Dr. Erling has an announcement.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for all of your time coming here today. This is wonderful. See you all. I'm representing the Bicentennial Committee for the 200th anniversary of ULS next year. And what we're providing is a chance for people who have been graduates and alums of United Lutheran Seminary to record a story at our story booth, which will be up at room 217, the Addie Butler room. And it'll between the time of 11:30 and 1, Professor Katie Day will be there, and later this afternoon, I will be there in the same, for between 2 and 3:30. At your alumni events, we're going to be having this opportunity for people to share memories, good times, friendships, events that meant something to them while they were students. Thank you so much.